This is a reading of the second Theaetetus, or the Theaetetus II, which is a sequel to the Sophist and Statesman dialogues of Plato, and also a sequel to Plato's Theaetetus, which I am the author of, and which you can find a copy of in the archive and Amazon links below. Now, I say this is a sequel to all of those because those make up a chain of interrelated dialogues which take place consecutively, one following the other. And I should first say that Plato foretold of a further dialogue within the Sophist and Statesman dialogues, a third investigation amongst the same characters and within the same setting is foretold and hinted at by Plato. Since the Sophist dialogue opens with Socrates asking the Eleatic stranger whether he thinks the Sophist, statesman, and philosopher are the same and one, or whether those are three different professions and expertise. And the Eleatic stranger says, it is easy to tell that they are three in different professions, but difficult to illustrate the nature of each. And then the Eleatic stranger goes on to illustrate the nature of the Sophist in one dialogue, and a separate dialogue is dedicated to the illustration of the nature of the statesman. And within those, a third topic of investigation is repeatedly referenced, of the investigation of the nature of the philosopher. And at one point, Theodorus says, Socrates, you will be 3 times as indebted to the Eleatic stranger when he illustrates for you the natures of the statesman and the philosopher also, after having completed the investigation of the nature of the Sophist. So there is explicit reference to a further investigation. That would be a separate dialogue that Plato indicates and foretells. He foretold of not even a reconvening of the same characters to discuss the philosopher, but in a continuation of the same prolonged discussion that was cut into 2 different dialogues, the Sophist and the Statesman, continuation of the discussion that would focus on the nature of the philosopher, that in the introductions of the Sophist and the Statesman, that is explicitly referenced and foretold that there was a conversation among those characters about that topic, in presumably the same setting, or that the Eleatic stranger had at least agreed, and Theodorus makes this clear again when he says, Socrates, you'll be 3 times as indebted to the Eleatic stranger when he illustrates for you the natures of the statesman and the philosopher also, after having already illustrated the nature of the Sophist. And Socrates jokingly jests that the great mathematician Theodorus slipped up in his arithmetic by weighing these out as equal units when no ratio of interval can explain the difference in value between those. But that is not significant to this point that I'm making. So this should be thought of as a spurious dialogue. There are spurious dialogues of Plato that are titled as authored by Plato, which are not. Some of them perhaps are. Such as the introduction to the laws and the epinomis, the sequel to the laws. Some of them, like those, the spurious dialogues, are or were authored by Plato. The Minos, I believe, or whatever the title is to the introductory dialogue before the laws, and the epinomis about astronomy, those were written by Plato. But there are many spurious dialogues that were not written by Plato, that were claimed to be. And you can tell that they don't have the stylistic, they don't have setting and characters. They just jump into Socrates and friend. The character is usually just friend of Socrates. And they're less artistically developed. Now, this should be thought of as a spurious dialogue or even as having more acclaim to the Platonic corpus than the spurious dialogues, besides the epinomis and the Minos, or the introduction to the laws. Because the course of investigation, the setting, the whole dialogue was foretold within the Sophist and Statesman dialogues. Now, Plato referenced a continuation of the discussion, or a further discussion that would investigate the nature of the philosopher along similar lines that the Sophists and Statesmen were investigated and illustrated. And those, of course, took place the day following the Theaetetus. And that Theaetetus was one of the main interlocutors of the Sophist. That all of those, that at the end of the Theaetetus, the characters Theodorus, Theaetetus, and Socrates agreed to reconvene the following day. And then at the beginning of the Sophists, they reference that point that was made and say explicitly, we have arrived as we had agreed. And Theodorus brought significantly the Eleatic stranger. Now, not only does the dialogue have a sort of place within the Platonic corpus for being hinted at and foretold or referenced as a further conversation that had happened, a further conversation that had occurred amongst those same characters from the Sophist and Statesman dialogues. But also, the course of investigation follows the same mode, the same method of division, which is somewhat unique amongst the dialogues that we find in the Sophists and Statesmen. And those dialogues reference the philosopher in order to distinguish what the Sophist is, for example, references made to what the philosopher is. And we are provided with sort of half definitions or partial identifications that then we can use within as when set within as a primary target of investigation. And in the Statesman dialogues too, they also provide a number of divisions with which we are able to apply in our investigation of the philosopher. That is why this is very much a Platonic dialogue. This is almost can fall within the corpus of Plato as at least a spurious dialogue that someone may say, well, that wasn't written by Plato. Sure. Well, the spurious dialogues, for the most part, weren't either. And they claim to be, because they claim to be following the same as written by students of Plato at around the same time, were following the same methods, using the same characters, the same themes, everything that were in imitation of Plato's dialogues. That's how this should be thought of, not as a product of my imagination, nor of my fancy, nor of my invention. They're not dialogues that I just imagine as having taken place with artistic creativity or something, with the license of artistic creativity. The answers provided might not even be said, though I agree with them, to be my answers. They're what can be found within the Sophist and Statesman dialogues and the Theaetetus and the whole corpus of Plato. So I will read the beginning of, or the first half of the Theaetetus 2, or the second Theaetetus, and I will try to highlight the points, especially during the introductory passages, which show how this is tied up with the Theaetetus and the Sophist and Statesman dialogues, and attempts to be. And the subtitle can be the philosopher, since really this is a sequel of the Sophist and Statesman more than anything. And the sequel that was promised when Theodorus said, Socrates, you will be 3 times as indebted to the Eleatic stranger, when he illustrates the natures of the statesman and philosopher, after having already illustrated the nature of the sophist. Which foretold a future, or foretold a continuation of that discussion that would focus on the philosopher. Now, I provide that dialogue, and I provide the investigation as aligned with this sort of way, using the method of division, which is unique to this trilogy. The sort of way that the sophists and statesmen were identified, because many hints are provided in those. And perhaps Plato's point was to direct us towards a knowledge of what the philosopher is. As for instance, he says in the Sophist, or the Eleatic stranger says, or perchance we may have stumbled upon the philosopher in our course after the Sophist, and provided some sort of a definition or illustration or a brief description of what the philosopher is, as distinct from the Sophist, since that distinction was explicitly referenced to identify the Sophist, so that that didn't get confused with the philosopher in that dialogue. Then we can take that into a separate dialogue and use that as the primary course of investigation, not just using that on the side to identify and distinguish what is the topic of investigation, the sophist. And that should be clear. So I call this a second Theaetetus, or subtitled the philosopher, because this is a sequel to the Sophist and Statesman dialogues, which are tied in with the Theaetetus. And Theaetetus, again, was one of the main interlocutors in the Sophist. Now, this will be clear with the scene. Characters of the dialogue: Socrates, Theodorus of Cyrene, the great geometer and mathematician; Theaetetus, the younger Socrates, who isn't to be confused with Socrates, but is a companion of Theaetetus; and the Eleatic stranger, who is a disciple of Zeno and Parmenides, and the Eleatic school, which I should say first, when at the beginning of this trilogy, at the beginning of the Sophist, the Eleatic stranger says that no, the Sophist, statesman, and philosopher are not one and the same profession. Those are distinctly separate sciences and separate professions. There is something significant, since the Eleatic school, if you don't ask somebody within the inner circle, who would consider them more as a dialectical school, are by the many thought to advocate for an inclusive monism, inclusive everything is one, and there's one whole or one unit. Very different positions. Anyways, Eleatic stranger says, no, those are three very different professions and expertise, and they have different forms of knowledge. So to begin, the scene. Euclides and Terpsian meet in front of Euclides' house in Megara. They enter the house, and the dialogue is read to them by a servant. Now, that is also the opening line of the Theaetetus, which I should say the Theaetetus was a dialogue between Socrates, Theodorus, and Theaetetus, but is described as a conversation that was retold first from Socrates to Euclides of Megara, who then wrote down what Socrates had told to him about that conversation, and kept going back to Athens to ask Socrates to help fill in the blanks of what he couldn't remember of that conversation, and then retold from Euclides, or read by Euclides then, after having pieced together the story as retold by Socrates, to Terpsion and Megara. And Megara, and Euclides' house, the house of Euclides and Megara, is where Plato fled, and where all the students of Socrates, the disciples of Socrates, fled when they were persecuted. And Plato fled to Euclides' house. Euclides is very significant. And there's also a reason why he is confounded with Euclid of Alexandria, the mathematician, and why Theaetetus discovered a great many proofs that Euclid of Alexandria, who composed the elements of Euclid, Theaetetus is responsible for the most complex book, for the last book, for figuring out the Platonic solids. He was able to give proofs of how these are structured. Theaetetus is one of the most advanced mathematicians. And this is a discussion with him as a youth, as he was a student of Theodorus of Cyrene, the great mathematician, geometer. And all that plays into this, because the mathematician will become part of this dialogue too. So this opens with the same line as the Theaetetus, because I set this as having been retold directly after the retelling or the reading of the Theaetetus by Euclides to Terpsion. And this isn't meant to be confusing. This is how many Plato's dialogues open. That this is a retelling of a conversation that happened. And I say that the retelling of this dialogue happened directly after Euclides retold to Terpsion the Theaetetus dialogue. And here he's retelling to Terpsion the same house in Megara, the Theaetetus too. While the actual conversation happens directly after the Statesman dialogue, after the Sophist and Statesman dialogues, which was the next day, as the Theaetetus, which Euclides retold to Terpsion, as Plato displays. And that is not meant to be confusing or weird, but that ties this in with those dialogues at the scene. Euclides and Terpsion meet in front of Euclides' house in Megara. They enter the house, and the dialogue is read to them by a servant. The dialogue, as a previous conversation related from Socrates to Euclides, and then retold from Euclides to Terpsion, takes place as retold in Megara immediately following Euclides' narration of the Theaetetus dialogue to Terpsion. However, the conversation that is retold in Megara took place immediately following the conversations of the Sophists and Statesman, which occurred the following day after Socrates' first conversation with Theaetetus, and which was among of the same characters with the addition of the Eleatic stranger and the younger Socrates who Theodorus brought. That is a scene. Euclides of Megara. Here, Terpsion, I have another transcript of a conversation between Theaetetus and Socrates that you would like to hear. Again, Euclides of Megara. Here, Terpsion, I have another transcript of a conversation between Theaetetus and Socrates that you would like to hear. I think you are familiar with the conversations that took place the day following the one we just read. It is the Theaetetus. Instead of Theodorus and Theaetetus conversing with Socrates by themselves, the following day they brought the younger Socrates, a companion of Theaetetus, and they brought a stranger from Elea, who is a disciple of Zeno and Parmenides. And he, the Eleatic stranger, explained the natures of the Sophist and Statesman. Terpsion. I am aware of the discourses about the Sophists and Statesmen that happened the following day. What was the topic of this other dialogue? And I want to read this footnote from the beginning of the Sophist, where Theodorus says, according to our yesterday's agreement, Socrates, we have come ourselves as we were bound to, and we bring also this man with us. He is a stranger from Elea, one of the followers of Parmenides and Zeno, and a real philosopher. So Terpsion says, what was the topic of this other dialogue? I am aware of the discourses about the Sophists and Statesmen that followed the one we just read. Euclides of Megara. Well, the following topic in sequence after the Sophist and Statesman discourses was the philosopher, as Theodorus and the stranger from Elea agreed would also be illustrated. Terpsion. I remember that. Euclides of Megara. That exactly is the topic of this other discourse that Socrates narrated. That exactly is the topic of this other discourse that Socrates narrated to me on my visits to Athens. And I wrote them down from memory, and afterwards would return again to Athens and make corrections after talking to Socrates again. Again, that is how Euclides is described as retelling the Theaetetus dialogue in Plato's Theaetetus, when he says, according as this footnote shows, but I made notes at the time as soon as I reached home. Then afterwards at my leisure, as I recalled things, I wrote them down. And whenever I went to Athens, I used to ask Socrates about what I could not remember. And then I came here and made corrections, so that I have pretty much the whole talk written down. Terpsion responds, I would greatly like to hear that discussion, for it must have taken place the following day after the discussion we just listened to being read between Socrates and Theaetetus. Euclides of Megara. Yes, it was the next day after the previous discussion concerning the nature of knowledge that we just went over. And this discussion was between Socrates and Theaetetus also, for reasons which will be clear when you hear it read. Terpsion. Please then proceed. Euclides. Here, boy, take and read the transcript of the discussion now. Servant reads. And what follows is Socrates. And I have not used characters. I have not inserted characters' names within the text because, according to my graduate school, Plato also did not in some manuscripts, or that isn't such a concern, as the characters are obvious. It's an interchange between an elder, Socrates, and Theaetetus, who is a willing, passive answerer. He's answering as a student, not as a content, which is a significant distinction to make between the Platonic dialogues of whether the argument is between contestants or sort of didactically between somebody who's of a much greater age than someone who's around 20 years old or so, who's a passive and willing answer. So Socrates starts. Now let younger Socrates rest, and let also the stranger sit back. If Theaetetus had been the last one talking with the Eleatic stranger, then I should like to have my turn with the younger Socrates, my namesake. But the younger Socrates needs a break, and we should let the stranger have a chance to observe the speech of Athenians amongst Athenians as a visitor and friend, and not press him to such a task. For the Eleatic stranger says that he is somewhat ashamed to carry on the discussion as if he were giving a sort of exhibition, either as an address of his own or in response to another. Again, in the Sophist, the stranger says, Socrates, this is the first time I have come among you, and I am somewhat ashamed instead of carrying on the discussion by merely giving brief replies to your questions, to deliver an extended, long drawn-out speech, either as an address of my own or in reply to another, as if I were giving a sort of exhibition. But I must, for really the present subject is not what one might expect from the form of the question, but is a matter for a very long speech. On the other hand, it seems unfriendly and discourteous to refuse a favor to you and these gentlemen, especially when you have spoken as you did. And Socrates continues, wouldn't the gods, or even the wise among men, rather be spectators in the Pythian or Olympic games than competitors? For I've heard so on the other side of our visitor's Italian peninsula, on the coast of the Ionian Sea, rather than the Tyrrhenian Sea, where his Eleatic school is set. He himself claims he isn't visiting Athens to give instruction and leave with our wealth like Gorgias and Hippias do. After sometimes less discussion than our friend the Eleatic stranger has already presented for us. Then also I owe you, Theodorus, for introducing me to Theaetetus and the Eleatic stranger. And I owe the stranger for bringing to light the natures of the Sophist and Statesman. I want to read another footnote from the Statesman. Socrates says, really, I'm greatly indebted to you, Theodorus, for my acquaintance with Theaetetus and with the Eleatic stranger too. And beyond that, to continue, I prefer Theaetetus among Athenian youths in conversation, now that Alcibiades, son of Cleinias, and Glaucon, son of Ariston, and the uncle of Glaucon on his mother's side, Charmides, have aged. And I think that if I don't have to yield to request the stranger's aid in our next discussion, the debt of the other two discussions will be more than paid. And the footnote is still relevant. I will only read the footnotes for the beginning. Theodorus says, presently, Socrates, you'll be 3 times as much indebted when they have worked out the statesman and the philosopher for you. Again, indicating and foretelling that there would be a discussion, or that there was a discussion that must follow these lines about the philosopher. Presently, Socrates, I will be 3 times as much indebted. Presently, Socrates, you will be 3 times as much indebted, says Theodorus, when they have worked out the statesman and the philosopher for you. Again, Plato didn't compose a separate dialogue about the philosopher. Socrates responds, this is still the footnotes. Indeed, my dear Theodorus, can I believe my ears? Were those really the words of the great mathematician and geometrician? Theodorus, what do you mean, Socrates? Why, what do you mean, Socrates? Socrates, when you rated sophist, statesman, and philosopher at the same value, though they are further apart in worth than your mathematical proportion can express. Theodorus, by Ammon, our special divinity of Cyrene. That is a good hit, Socrates. Evidently, you haven't forgotten your mathematics, and you are quite right in finding fault with my bad arithmetic. I will get even with you at some other time, but now, stranger, I turn to you. And to continue, Socrates, with Socrates' statement, introductory statement. However, Eleatic stranger, don't resist coming to my aid if we turn off course. Now, this is Socrates speaking, turning to Theaetetus. What is the philosopher's art? Now that we have come to terms about the sophist and statesman, tell me, Theaetetus, whether you think the philosopher has the same expertise as either the sophist or the statesman, or if he has an entirely different kind of skill. I should say he has an entirely different kind of skill. Then answer if we should look for the philosopher among the same divisions that we made in our course after the statesman or not. Which do you mean? The first, where we admitted a division of all expertise into theoretical and practical. Again, this is the course of investigation provided within the statesman dialogue, which we are following to identify the philosopher. Which division do you mean? The first, where we admitted a division of all expertise into theoretical and practical. Yes, that is where we should begin looking for the philosopher too, where almost no one can escape our net. That is, unless we conclude that he is only a madman. Like the Sophist, he could escape our net perhaps if we aren't careful. So first tell me, Theaetetus, if you would place the philosopher in the class of theoretical or of practical expertise, art or science. In the theoretical class, for even their declaimers say they're disconnected from anything with the slightest admixture of earth in its composition. And for this, they point to their lack of any practical use or interest in anything of practical utility. Many don't even regard the seasons of the year, their own health, their own poverty, even the depravity of their city or the well-being of their family. Then, if they are regarded as struck with madness, will that really throw them outside the bounds of theoretical and practical and outside of expertise? In any case, their defamers will say so, though I doubt they won't have a defense for accusations against their insanity and their madness. Still, we can begin by placing them in the theoretical class of expertise and leave off with that and divide that into parts which the philosopher must fall into. Still, we can begin by placing them in the theoretical class of expertise and divide that into parts which the philosopher must fall into. And I want to read a footnote, the reason why there's a mention of madness. From the Sophist. However, I fancy it is not much easier, if I may say so, to recognize this class of the philosopher than that of the gods. For these men, I mean those who are not feignedly, but really philosophers, appear disguised in all sorts of shapes, thanks to the ignorance of the rest of mankind. And to quote Homer, visit the cities, beholding from above the life of those below. And they seem to some to be of no worth, to others to be worth everything. Sometimes they appear disguised as statesmen, and sometimes as sophists. And sometimes they may give people the impression that they are altogether mad. And this quote from Homer's Odyssey is in reference, first and foremost, to Athena appearing to Telemachus, or presenting herself to Telemachus under the guise of Mentor, king of the Taphians. And that within Homer, the gods often take on a disguise and present themselves to mankind under the guise of some man that they would already be acquainted with even. Now, this quote also somewhat illustrates the difficulty of identifying the philosopher in Socrates' position. That they appear disguised in all sorts of shapes and visit the cities beholding from above those below. And they seem to some to be of no worth and to others to be worth everything. And sometimes they appear disguised as statesmen, and sometimes they appear disguised as sophists, and sometimes they may give some people the impression that they are altogether mad. But we are to leave off the digression about their madness. We have placed the philosopher within a theoretical class of expertise, not the practical, after saying that all forms of expertise must fall into either one or the other of them, either being practical or theoretical. Then, of the kind of expertise concerned only with words and of making judgments without producing anything, concerned only with words and knowledge, What is the primary division of that kind of expertise? I don't know. Can you say? We can follow the stranger's lead and divide the theoretical class into those that command or direct some process with their knowledge and those that don't, but are only concerned with persuasion and judgment. Okay, and which of these paths should we follow in our course after the philosopher? The theoretical class that does not command or direct any action. And how should we divide that? That is a difficult question. And with good reason, Theaetetus. What is that? Because of the diverse figures that are concerned with speech and persuasion. Do you think there is anything that some people at least, won't lapse into what is called idle chatter about? That people don't try to convince each other about? Are there not myriads of people listening to each other talk about what Homer means by something or other? Or what the best of any art or craft is? Or of what is the best painting? Whether of some collection here or of all paintings, or between two paintings and 10,000 other trivial concerns? Yes, people get so carried away about convincing each other and other people about almost all things that here in Athens, I could turn around any street corner and think that the people whose conversation I encountered were arguing over the most important things to them. But I want to stop and reference this term idle chatter. We're trying to make a division within theoretical expertise that is only concerned with words and knowledge. The reason I use the term idle chatter is because that is the term that Parmenides prescribes to Socrates in that dialogue, again, regarding the Eleatic school. And this might be a digression, but I think is worth making. That people lapse into what is called idle chatter about. And that is a reason why there's a difficulty in making a division within expertise, which is only concerned with words and knowledge. That idle chatter, and that is the sort of extra stuff, the people that are arguing about everything. And some of them seem to be experts, also rhetoricians and everything like that. That is in the way of identifying the philosopher. That in the Parmenides, there's important point, at exactly the point where Parmenides seems to have disproved Socrates' theory of the ideas, which he made when he was like 20. Yet admits, really, that this is just a difficult thing to argue for. Parmenides tells Socrates, the impulse that carries you towards philosophy is assuredly noble and divine. But there is an art which is called by the vulgar idle talking, and which is often imagined to be useless. In that you must train and exercise yourself, now that you are young, or truth will elude your grasp. And this is a passage in which Parmenides has just sort of somewhat, people take this as having disproved the forms, disproved the existence of separate forms of ideas. But Parmenides really says these Socrates are a few and only a few of the difficulties in which we are involved if ideas really are, and we determine each one of them to be an absolute unity. He who hears what may be said against them will deny their very existence. And even if they do exist, he will say that they must of necessity be unknown to man. And he will seem to have reason on his side. And as we were remarking just now, will be very difficult to convince. A man must be gifted with very considerable ability before he can learn that everything has a class and an absolute essence. And still more remarkable will he be who discovers all these things for himself and, having thoroughly investigated them, is able to teach them to others. Notice how Parmenides is saying that this is just a difficult task. And yet, Socrates, said Parmenides, if a man fixing his attention on these and the like difficulties does away with the ideas of things and will not admit that every individual thing has its own determinate idea, which is always one and the same, he will have nothing on which to rest his mind. And so he will utterly destroy the power of reasoning, as you seem to me to have particularly noted already. But then what will become of philosophy? Whither shall we turn if the ideas are unknown? Socrates says, I don't see my way out at present. Yes, said Parmenides, and I think that this arises, Socrates, out of your attempting to define the beautiful, the just, the good, and the ideas generally, without sufficient previous training. I noted your deficiency when I heard you talking here with your friend Aristoteles, a day before yesterday. The impulse that carries you towards philosophy is assuredly noble and divine, but there is an art which is called by the vulgar idle talking, which is often imagined to be useless. In that you must train and exercise yourself now that you are young, or truth will elude your grasp. And what is the nature of this exercise which you recommend, Parmenides? That which you heard Zeno practicing. At the same time, I give you credit for saying to him that you did not care to examine the perplexity in reference to visible things, or to consider the question that way, but only with reference to objects of thought, and which might be called ideas. Well, yes, there appears to me no great difficulty in showing by this method that visible things are like and unlike. Quite true, said Parmenides, but I think you should go a step further and consider not only the consequences which flow from a given hypothesis, but also the consequences which flow from denying the hypothesis. And that will be still better training for you. What do you mean? I mean, for example, that in the case of this very hypothesis of Zeno's about the many, you should inquire not only what will be the consequences to the many in relation to themselves and to the one in relation to itself and the many, on the hypothesis of the being of many, but also what will be the consequences to the one and the many in relation to themselves and each other on the opposite hypothesis, if being is not one. Or again, if likeness is or is not. What will be the consequences in either case of these cases to the subjects of the hypothesis and to other things in relation both to themselves and to one another, and so of unlikeness. The same holds good of motion and rest and generation, destruction. So, I wish not to continue with that. That is why I reference the term idle talking, because this is what makes a mess of figuring out what the expertise of words and knowledge, what the division in that is. What are the natural species? What are the natural kinds of that? When there are these people that are idly chattering and which appear as experts in various fragmental fields of conversation and not even knowledge. To continue. Yes, people get so carried away with convincing each other and other people about almost all things that here in Athens, I could turn around any street corner and think that the people whose conversation I encountered were arguing about the most important things to them, and that the will of some common relative was disagreed upon, or that they were arguing over the cause of the loss of our ships at Syracuse, and then find out that they are arguing over which of two comedies or tragedies is better, or something else as trivial as you can imagine. Then persuasion extends as an art to things verging on triviality. Persuasion, again, as somewhere within theoretical science of theoretical expertise of words and knowledge without as diametrically opposed from the class of practical expertise. There's a bunch of figures in there that have to be separated out, is what the point is. It seems that if rhetoricians can't spin webs into trivial concerns, that the idle talkers, especially groups of old men or of their wives, that pick up on the following morning with the thread or one of the threads of conversation they left off on the day before, at least the common groups that collect together in the agora, spin their threads of conversation about even trivial concerns. That is, whether they're experts or not. That is a science or not. Then expertise in words and persuasion, separated from anything practical or productive or acquired, will include figures like the rhetorician and the sophist, along with the philosopher's expertise we are after. Or is there not a resemblance in the difference between the philosopher and the statesman, and between the rhetorician and the statesman, or between the philosopher or the rhetorician with the craftsman? Doesn't the difference appear similar? Both the philosopher and the rhetorician, and the people that like to listen to speakers, seem equally disconcerted with practical use, spinning webs out of words and sounds, like their kinsman, perhaps the poet, whose attention never rests on daily concerns. Yes, the people who specialize in speech are a diverse crowd. Can we at least make a division along the line of the stage dividing the performers of the speeches and the rest that pay to listen to them? Can we at least make a division along the line of stage dividing the performers of the speeches and the rest that pay to listen to them, or that wait to listen to them in the council hall? In what way? Do you really think that if you hear a single discourse by Prodicus about the meanings of words and the roots of words, that you are as able to explain the meaning of some word as well as Prodicus by hearing a single discourse? Or do his students not distinguish themselves by if they paid to listen to the 1 or 2 drachma speech, or if they paid for the 50 drachma course? You mean to ask if someone can make the listeners of a single speech educated about the things he was speaking about? You mean to ask if someone can make the listeners of a single speech educated about those things he was speaking about? Yes, you follow my meaning. Is listening to one speech from anyone about anything enough to teach them about that so that they have the same expertise? No, even the simplest processes require further instruction than hearing a single speech about it. Then there is a significant difference we must take hold of within expertise in language, between the kind that takes the form of a speech from one person to a crowd of many listeners, and the kind of expertise in language that is between two people. That is easy to agree on. And instruction from one to one person is the common way of learning any craft, especially in the productive arts. Is that right? Yes, that is the way an apprentice learns from a master. However, those examples are productive, whereas we are looking for expertise in language apart from making or catching something. Still, have you noticed that an expert can use language to walk his apprentice through the steps of the process, and that without explanation in language, there is something missing from the understanding shared with the apprentice, and that the apprentice's ability to answer questions in speech from his master about the process he's learning is a sign of his having received the expertise. Yes, and that goes well with what we talked about yesterday, when we agreed that knowledge should be able to provide an explanation, that knowledge should be able to provide an account. And do you hear anything like an explanation or an account when there is a speech and the many listeners are left to take each his own interpretation with them when they leave? No, I don't. But would an apprentice be left to guess at his labor like the students of Prodicus are left to go on unaided with their practices? No, a true apprentice would beg for an explanation before letting his master leave him to his work. Then at least the rhetorician will be distinguishable from the class we are looking for the philosopher in. Since we agreed that one person speaking to many people on a single occasion won't make the listeners instructed, so that they gain the science that they lacked before listening to the speech. I'm afraid there are a variety of other characters that need to be separated off the theoretical class that is not spoken to a crowd. The sophist art you found with Theodoras earlier. The sophist art you found with the Eleatic stranger earlier seems jumbled up in the theoretical class in which we are considering to find the philosopher. Which of the definitions we found of him? Remember that the stranger from Elea and you classed him as making imitations, that is, the sophist as making imitations, and that you specifically placed him in the division of the image-making art that was according to appearance, as opposed to the kind of image-making that makes the image in proportion to the original. This image-making by appearance was the class we placed the sophist, since that was the only way that he could feign to teach about all things. Yes, that was why we said he was more of a painter than an instructor. That was why we said he was more of a painter than an instructor, because he feigned to teach about all things, because then he must be weaving appearances and imitations. Okay, then consider if something made according to the same proportion isn't the same thing. Whatever we say are its components, as in the case of a dish being cooked, the ingredients we would omit, so long as the parts were mixed to the same ratio, make up the same dish, so long as the ratio of ingredients is stable. Consider if something made according to the same proportion isn't the same thing. Whatever we say are its components. As we say of a dish being cooked, the ingredients we would omit, so long as the parts were mixed to the same ratio, make up the same dish, so long as the ratio of ingredients is stable. Sure, that is no problem. Then again, if someone either mixes the ingredients to the wrong ratio, yet the appearance of the same dish is preserved, or they paint or duplicate an image of the dish that seems to pass for the actual dish according to the true proportions, wouldn't you say that that is an appearance only and shouldn't be called by the same name as what it is modeled after? Yes. But if it were according to the true proportions of the thing, and its components weren't only painted the same color and not only two-dimensional as some kinds of likeness making are, but the elements or ingredients in the composite thing were the same, then wouldn't the duplicate be also called by the same name as the thing it is a duplicate of, since its own parts would be in the same ratio as the parts of the original thing that is copied? What do you mean? That in the design of either ships or buildings, or in our previous example, in cooking a dish, in all these cases, the proportion or ratio of the thing's parts defines what the thing is. If it is a ship or a building, and the dimensions are of the same ratio as the original, and made with the same kinds of things, then the design is the same. If it is a ship or a building, and the dimensions are made, if it is a ship or a building and the dimensions are of the same ratio as the original, and made with the same kinds of things, then the design is the same. And if we are talking about a dish of food, then so long as the ingredients are of the same ratio, the outcome is the same dish. I agree with that much. And remember that we were talking about theoretical expertise, not practical. I remember. And our recent examples were of instruction about cooking a dish and designing or constructing ships and buildings. That is right. But we are inquiring after something that doesn't end in the production of anything or the practical use or outcome of anything, only in theorizing through speech and words. Yes, that was the aim of our inquiry. Then where should we turn? What likenesses are made in language or theory that have no productive or practical use, and yet the image has the same proportions as the original? Consider shapes and figures in geometry. Don't we speak of them as like or unlike according to their having the same or different genus or species? Don't we speak of them as like or unlike figures in geometry according to their having the same or different genus or species? That is, two figures with the same genus are like in that respect, is it that they are similar for having the same genus of rectilinear figure. If they have the same species, they are like and unlike, or they are alike or unlike isosceles triangles. As for example, we say isosceles triangles are all alike in terms of their having the same species. Isosceles, we say isosceles triangles are all alike in terms of their having the same species, isosceles, and having the same genus, triangular. Then we say isosceles and scalene triangles are all alike in terms of their having the same genus, triangular, but unlike in terms of their having different species. Yes. Then things that are alike are what they are alike, and things that are unlike are not what they are unlike, according to the argument. In the geometrical way of speaking, at least. I can suggest, if you don't accept that account, then we turn to examples like those found in astronomy, where proportionate representations are made of the heavenly spheres, and also to maps of the oceans and continents. If I am to answer promptly, I must suggest those first. Although they aren't only in language, they are used by many for understanding without any further practical use. Right. In those cases, the representation is proportional to the original. And there is not only an appearance of a likeness, the way painting and some other imitative arts cast likenesses without the same proportion as the original they are modeled after. In the cases of devices like armillary spheres and astrolabes, the instrument or image in our previous language was proportional to the original. The instrument was proportional to the original, so that part to part and whole to whole, the image or device made represented the original thing meant to be mapped. In the case of a planetary sphere, the heavens. In the case of a map, the continents of the earth and the oceans. Yes, and those devices make possible the safe passage across seas and around continents, so that if they were false representations, They would result in the destruction or loss of ships and buildings, even though those aren't only theoretical, but are employed towards practical use. Right, Theaetetus. And you and the stranger said that the sophist is an image maker of all things, speaking as they do authoritative. And you and the stranger said that the sophist is an image maker of all things, speaking as they do authoritatively about everything upon the earth and everything beneath or above the earth, which you two said could only be the work of a painter or some other not serious way of showing things. As the stranger and you said the sophist is an image maker of all things, speaking as they do authoritatively about everything upon the earth and everything beneath and above the earth, which you two said could only be the work of a painter or some other not serious way of showing things. We said that, yes. And if we were to follow paintings like maps, we would soon find out that they were not proportional to the scene that is the subject of the paintings. Is that not obvious? And if we were to follow paintings like maps, we would soon find out that they were not proportional to the scene that is the subject of the painting, if we were to follow them like maps. Is that not obvious? That would obviously result in our utter ruin. Then also, if you and I followed some sophist like Gorgias or Hippias and took his account of how things are beneath and above and upon the earth, and how a young man should behave towards them, ignoring however we thought we should behave towards things before listening to him, do you think that there wouldn't be a danger in that? Or do you think that sophists can be right about everything from love to the fate of the dead, to the legislation of cities, and to the way a household should be looked after? Again, then also, if you and I followed some sophist like Gorgias or Hippias and took his account of how things are beneath and above and upon the earth, and how a young man should behave towards them, ignoring however we thought we should behave towards things before listening to him, do you think that there wouldn't be a danger in that? Or do you think that sophists can be right about everything from love to the fate of the dead, to the legislation of cities, and to the way a household should be looked after? Again, this follows the statement that sophists, by claiming to speak about all things, claiming authority of all things, are weaving paintings and images. And if we followed a painting like a map, we'd find out that the painting was not proportional to the scene that is the subject of the painting. So if we followed a sophist like Gorgias and Hippias and took his account of how things are beneath and above and upon the earth, and how a young man should behave towards them, ignoring however we thought we should behave towards things before listening to him, do you think there wouldn't be a great danger? Or do you think that sophists can be right about everything from love to the fate of the dead, to the legislation of cities, and to the way a household should be looked after? Following a sophist would be similar to following a painting of some coast as a map. And I wouldn't expect any less difficulty with following a sophist like Gorgias or Hippias and everything they say. Then again, Theaetetus, would you agree that if the representation were in proportion to the original, and not only by appearance like paintings, but having each side as well as the whole, the same proportionally to each equivalent side into the whole of the original model, that then the knowledge of the likeness, that is a true representation, would also bring with it the knowledge of what it is either describing or some mold or drawing of. Would you say that much? Yes, we already spoke of those kinds of things. Again, would you agree, however, that if the representation were made in proportion to the original, and not only by appearance like paintings, but having each side as well as the whole the same proportionally to each equivalent side into the whole of the original model, that then the knowledge of the likeness, that is a true representation, would also bring with it the knowledge of what it is either describing or some mold or drawing of? Would you say that much? Yes, we have already spoke of those kinds of things. And can a proportionate representation be described by words as well as by lines and shapes? If we take the elements of anything to be the parts, we describe it by proportionally. If of music, low and high notes. If of painting, bright and dark colors. In some things, there is no hindrance to the one way over the other. In your mathematics studies with Theodorus, you must be well aware that a melody can be described and taught by written notation or by speech, with relatively no difference in difficulty for the learner. And with geometry and also mechanics, for example, words as well as images can be used to describe the figure and the qualities the figure is claimed to have. Right. And it isn't the appearance of a circle or triangle that Theodorus leads you to, even if he seems to be sketching in the sand. As long as a likeness drawn is proportionate to the semicircle or right triangle that is under investigation, then the understanding of the sketch in the sand is sufficient to convey the understanding of the model that the likeness is made to the same proportions of. I follow. And where should we go from there? That illustrations in words can be made either according to proportion or only according to appearance. And that sciences like geometry and arithmetic are not meant to illustrate anything by appearance only. And for that matter, neither is medicine, which uses images in language and figure in illustrating health and disease, where the risk in confusing the recipe of a potion is the health and sometimes the life of the patient. And in many other things, there are proportionate images made in speech that share the knowledge of what they are only images of. That is fair enough. And are we to follow the proportionate and mathematical kind for our investigation of the philosopher? Yes, and if we call the whole class image making by proportion, that was distinguished from the kind of likeness making by appearance only, theoretical, being properly such, as opposed to the poetic license of other experts in language, we still then have to divide the theoretical class into kinds, or we are left with one mass of mathematicians and philosophers in a heap. I see. Then our search would be incomplete. So far, at least, the difference is clear between the philosopher and the figures we originally set out to distinguish him from, the sophist and the rhetorician, them especially, as well as the statesman. We should recall what was the difference between them. We said that the sophist was a maker of images and speech that were fantastical and by appearance, without the rigor of theoretical sciences like geometry and arithmetic. Right. And we said the rhetorician spoke as one person to a crowd of many, which was opposed to how instruction works, as a master instructing a single apprentice at a time. And the same things we said about the rhetorician applied to the sophist when he isn't speaking privately, for it is obvious how much more wealth can be collected by speaking to crowds than to individuals. Yes, and the sophist and rhetorician seem very closely related from this perspective. And remember that they were indistinguishable at first, with within the class of theoretical science that we started with, because they were impractical, like the philosopher, unlike the productive arts, and concerned only with words and without generating any product. Remember that the Sophist and rhetorician were indistinguishable at first within the class of theoretical science from the philosopher that we started with, because they were impractical like the philosopher, unlike the productive arts, and concerned only with words without generating any product. I remember that also. Consider also if we haven't made an error. What are you talking about? I'm afraid we let into the theoretical class everyone who was not practical, and then had to go in a roundabout way to part off these stray arts that are also concerned with persuasion and judgment, but that we agreed are not theoretical in the precise sense of the word. Perhaps every expertise that is not practical is not necessarily theoretical, and they are not contradictory classes. We will have to further consider that. A sign of our having made this mistake is the use of the same term, theoretical, in the species of expertise opposite of practical, and then again, without the addition of anything else, using the same term to designate a subspecies of the species with the same name, and calling rhetoric and sophistry not really theoretical, after already placing them in that class before. A sign of our having made this mistake is the use of the same term, theoretical, in the species of expertise opposite of practical, and then again, without the addition of anything else, using the same term to designate a subspecies of the species with the same name, and calling rhetoric and sophistry not really theoretical, after placing them in that class before as not being practical. We ought to recall how the stranger advised us to divide down the middle into classes of equal halves, not separating one species like humans from the rest of animal species immediately, without going through further differentia like two-legged and four-legged, then winged and unwinged, and after that, horned and not horned, and so on, until we come to the species we set out for. We should be careful to avoid that mistake by parting off rhetoric and sophistry individually from all other arts similarly concerned with persuasion, judgment, and speech. We should be careful to avoid that mistake by parting off rhetoric and sophistry individually from all other arts similarly concerned only with persuading, judgment, and speech. Can you list the divisions for me thus far? Yes. See if you think we only have to alter the repeated title of theoretical, or add something to the name, or if we have made a more serious mistake. Okay. Starting with the genus of expertise, we followed the division that the stranger made before between practical and theoretical, and we took the path of theoretical. Then we followed his second division, but instead of following the statesman into the commanding or directing class of theoretical expertise, we followed the opposing class for the philosopher, which was said merely to furnish knowledge without commanding or directing anything like a state or a household. Starting with the genus of expertise, I'm going to read this again. We followed the division that the stranger made before between the practical and theoretical, and we took the path of theoretical. Then we followed his second division, but instead of following the statesman into the commanding or directing class of theoretical expertise, we followed the opposing class for the philosopher, which was said to merely furnish knowledge without commanding or directing anything like a state or a household. It was from this class of theoretical expertise that does not command or direct anything that we admitted the rhetorician and the sophist, along with the philosopher we seek. I follow that far, Socrates. And I don't see a problem with rhetoric and sophistry falling within the same class as philosophy at that point of the divisions made. For unless they fall into the practical class, they will have to fall within the theoretical class. And within that, they cannot be said to command or direct anything either, which was the only other species mentioned. Plus, what ties together rhetoric and sophistry to philosophy at that species is concerned purely with words and persuasion and judgment. Again, Theaetetus says, I follow that far, Socrates, and I don't see a problem with rhetoric and sophistry falling within the same class as philosophy at that point in the divisions made. For unless they fall into the practical class, they will have to fall within the theoretical class. And within that, they cannot be said to command or direct anything either, which was the only other species mentioned. Plus, what ties together rhetoric and sophistry to philosophy at that species is concerned purely with words and persuasion and judgment. And do you think persuasion and judgment are the same? Well, yes, as they have been used in the argument so far, at least. Maybe we should wait to consider that. Okay. Then so far, we agree that the sophist and rhetorician are in the same class as regards to the divisions mentioned. Yes. Do you remember that in your conversation with the Eleatic stranger, that the first, second, third, and fourth attempts at a definition of the sophist involved his concern with making money, whether selling what he himself produces or as a merchant of the productions of others? I remember that, yes. And that would in one fell swoop place the sophist in the practical class rather than the theoretical? I suppose so. But then the sophist and rhetorician shouldn't resurface again in confusion with the philosopher, mathematician, or the statesman's crafts. They shouldn't have in that case, but of course they have in the argument so far. That is probably why the stranger continued with your investigation and didn't rest content with money making as the final distinction. Yes, at that point, the matter was indistinct and not final. That is nonetheless a common attack that philosophers make upon sophists, and with good reason. However, we should be weary to distinguish sophists or any other craft or art or science by something which is common to them all, or at least common to most, as exchange for money is. Wouldn't you say, Theaetetus? Again, however, we should be weary to distinguish sophists or any other craft by something which is common to them all, or at least common to most, as exchange for money is. Wouldn't you say, Theaetetus? That wouldn't be appropriate, no. Take as an example medicine and gymnastics, which are both set over the benefit of the body. If medicine were a craft that didn't receive wages, and I should ask you to recall that Asclepius, if medicine were a craft that didn't receive wages, and I should ask you to recall that Asclepius, son of Apollo, was said to be struck down with lightning in punishment for receiving a bribe from a rich man to heal him on point of death. And personal trainers of gymnastics did earn wages. Then would our distinction of these two arts set over the body and its benefit by the one receiving wages in exchange for their service and the other not receiving wages in exchange for their service be credible? Or would something be lacking from the explanation? I think something would be lacking from the explanation, Socrates. For without doubt, there is a further and more prominent difference between medicine and gymnastics, even under the assumption of the hypothesis that medicine doesn't receive wages and gymnastics does. Because, Theaetetus, even if trainers in gymnastics receive wages and medical physicians do not, if the physical trainer were receiving wages in exchange for something other than the benefit of the body in respect of gymnastics, You wouldn't then call his profession a trainer in gymnastics on account of his receiving pay, would you? No, I wouldn't. Then we can't call them moneymakers and distinguish them that way if we can't call them physical trainers while they make money by some other means, like selling copper or tin. No. And is a herder of horses an expert in anything except the benefit of horses? No. And if he herds and benefits horses, whether or not he receives much or little pay, or none at all, wouldn't make a difference as to calling him an equestrian. No, either way, he would be an equestrian. And with all the other arts and crafts and sciences, aren't there differences in terms of the differences of their subject matter and not of their wages? Yes, that seems right. Then won't we have to say the same thing as regards the sophist? If his subject is the goods of the soul, and we further say that he produces or resells those in exchange for pay, and attempt to define his art thereby, we will have the same problem with a superficial distinction that doesn't refer to the subject of the art itself, and only to something common to many, if not all other arts. Yes, that is most likely why the stranger from Elea continued with our quest of catching the sophist. And it is also apparent that the sophist would reappear and not settle in our And it is also apparent that the sophist would reappear and not settle in our defining him by his earning wages, right? Yes. Then to continue with our discussions, we went on to distinguish speech from one person to a crowd of many from speech between two people in terms of persuasion and judgment. And after that, we made another division between likeness making by appearance and likeness making by proportion, agreeing to take up the kind that was by proportion and not to follow the kind that is only by appearance, which we agreed was the sophist class. Do you expect that I see a problem there? Only perhaps that the first distinction follows the second in order, instead of the sequence in which we took them. Or again, that the question about the difference or similitude of persuasion and judgment, or of different kinds of those things, if they were, as you said they were, used in the same sense thus far, can be raised. Can you explain? First, we divide the theoretical expertise. Let me repeat this. Only perhaps the problem is that only perhaps the first distinction follows the second in order, instead of the sequence in which we took them. Or again, that the question about the difference or similitude of persuasion and judgment, or of different kinds of those, if they were, as you said, they were used in the same sense thus far, can be raised. Can you explain? First, we divide theoretical expertise that does not direct or command by the differentia of by appearance and by proportion. And after that, we divide the kind that is by appearance into the same division that we use to separate rhetoric, one person speaking to many and two people speaking together. Or else, if we begin with the distinction of speaking to crowds or individuals, we would have to look for the sophist amongst the kind that is between two people and not from someone to a crowd of many, which otherwise wouldn't have to yet be determined. And then the sophist would be more related to the philosopher than to the rhetorician. And rhetoric would arguably fall outside of the kind distinguished as by appearance and might fall within the kind we said was by proportion. But perhaps you don't see the difference. We want to place the rhetorician and the sophist under the class we distinguished as by appearance. That is why I asked you if there are two kinds of persuasion and judgment, or if those themselves were different or the same. If both rhetoric and sophism use the same kind of persuasion or judgment, and that's what separates them from the proportional kind of persuasion or judgment. That is why I want to read this again. That is why I asked if there are two kinds of persuasion and judgment, or if those themselves were different or the same. Notice that we are agile with words. If they say two words are the same, we can still ask if there are not two kinds of those synonyms. That is why I asked if there are two kinds of persuasion and judgment, or if those themselves were different or the same. If both rhetoric and sophism use the same kind of persuasion or judgment, and that's what separates them from the proportional kind of persuasion or judgment, then that distinction should be made before asking about whether the persuasive speech is given to a crowd or is held between individuals, or else rhetoric will be indeterminate as regards to the distinctions of by appearance and by proportion. I would ask you if that difference is the distinguishing factor of the kinds of persuasion. And if both the rhetorician and the sophist use the kind that is by appearance rather than by proportion, or since we already affirmed that about the sophist, if you would deny that the rhetorician isn't also a weaver of appearances. Yes, I agree that they use the same kind of persuasion, and that is distinguished as by appearance, and how that clears up the issue. I mean that we should ask that before asking whether or not the speech is directed at a crowd or back and forth between two people. Yes. And either way, we have the problem of calling the kind of theoretical expertise in persuasion that is by appearance, not really theoretical, as opposed to the theoretical expertise in persuasion that is by proportion, really being theoretical. Either way, again, we have the problem of calling the kind of theoretical expertise in persuasion that is by appearance, not really theoretical, as opposed to the theoretical expertise in persuasion that is by proportion, really being theoretical. Maybe, Socrates, we only have to adjust the names, because perhaps there is a loose sense of using the word theoretical as opposed to the practical species, because perhaps there is a loose sense of using the word theoretical as opposed to the practical species. That includes persuasion in the general sense, as meaning non-practical and purely concerned with speech and persuasion. And then that we use theoretical in the more precise meaning of the word to designate mathematics in the kind that was said to be by proportion. That is clear. Even the agile can be tripped by that confusion if we don't spell out the difference when using terms in both the loose and the precise meaning of the word. At least we agreed and can take caution from here on. Good, and I think we can proceed. Now, the statesman wasn't tied in this mess at the beginning of our discussion, was he? No. We started from the same division that was made to find the statesman, but where the statesman was classed in theoretical science at first, as opposed to practical. We made him the director of producing something, the director of a process, the peace and independence of the state and all the people in the state. Didn't we say he directs more than just passes judgment? That he has to oversee the production or maintenance of those things in the state? Whereas the purely theoretical class finishes with their task when they come to the conclusion of the inference, without needing to produce, acquire, destroy, or maintain anything. Yes, we said that. And besides that, you and the stranger use the example of the wholesaler and the retail salesman. to show that the king or statesman was like the wholesaler, and that the herald or the local governor was like the retail salesman. And you also distinguish them by the king and statesman ruling themselves and others, while the herald and governors direct the rule of others without possessing the origin of what they apply. We also said that. And the wholesaler is similar in that distinction too, by being the origin of the product sold, rather than in the middle, where the middle buys from someone other than themselves and resells to yet others. In both cases, the origin of the product or the authority is distinct from the resale and application of the product or authority. Then consider if there isn't a parallel between the mathematician and the theoretical class, and the king or statesman and the practical and productive and maintenance class. In what way? Wouldn't you say that geometry and arithmetic are like parents to the other theoretical sciences, either both together or how they are spoken of by Theodorus and others as singly producing by their own application other sciences? There are the two obvious ones, astronomy and harmonics. Astronomy is generally taken to be an application of geometry, where geometry is of static, motionless shapes and their qualities. Astronomy has the same subject matter of shapes and of points set in motion, traveling along shapes. Then harmonics is said to be the application of arithmetic, where numeric ratios determine the pitch and numbers are applied as a tool to sound, and also has the addition of motion that neither arithmetic nor geometry have. That harmonics and astronomy are the application of arithmetic and geometry with the addition of motion. Yes, we have been made familiar with harmonics and astronomy and their relative complexity compared to arithmetic and geometry. Then is there a parallel between the mathematician and the other theoretical sciences, and how we spoke of the statesman as relative to the herald or the local governor? In the same way, we said that the wholesaler is different from the retail salesman. Then is there a parallel between the mathematician and other theoretical sciences and how we spoke of the statesman as relative to the local governor? In the same way, we said the wholesaler is different from the retail salesman, that a king is the source of his authority, as distinct from the heralds and governors of provinces that are not the source of their authority, but implement the laws they receive from some authority that doesn't implement anyone else's laws. With the mathematician's relationship to harmonics and astronomy, as well as the other theoretical sciences. Should we say that the relationship between these things is through application? At least the mathematical ones are applied to the other theoretical sciences, and the authority is applied or implemented from the statesman or king to the heralds or governors. Yes, and the retail statesman might be said to apply the product that he buys wholesale, then resells again to someone else through a process of application. Then we can agree that by application, mathematics and also the authority of statesmanship are used by other theoretical sciences, in the other case, governors of provinces, can't we? We can, and then are similar in that way, one as the leader of the theoretical class and the other as the leader of the productive class. Then we ought not to forget that the statesman's craft and the mathematician's craft are of entirely different subject matter, but have the analogous role in their own classes of being the source of the others and applied in them, the one of harmonics, astronomy, and the other theoretical sciences, and the other of governors implementing the laws they legislate. Then it seems like the mathematician has prevailed like the great king's royal cavalry and has saved the theoretical kinds of expertise from both the practical and the poetic. Again, then it seems like the mathematician has prevailed like the great king's royal cavalry and has saved the theoretical kinds of expertise from both the practical and the poetic. You know how the general is granted statesmanship through victory when the state is disposed to be overcome by its enemies. You know how the general is granted statesmanship through victory when the state is disposed to be overcome by its enemies. Yes, the general is said to be granted statesmanship through custom and law in some places, and often secures his own position when either the spoils are significant enough or the state is at risk as a whole, or the king dies. And I want to say here that the executive office has always been tied to the general. And that whether a king or a president or a prime minister, the executive office has always been the leader of the military and concerned chiefly with the military role of defending the state. That is why George Washington was the first president. Because just like the Roman consuls, their first responsibility was defense of the state. The Roman consuls were the generals of the military. That is why George Washington was the first president, because he was the general. And the early Americans considered the executive office to simply be the general, which there is a ceremonial preservance of that, but there is not actually that. Where the Roman consuls would actually lead the army. And would design the military campaigns, not just be a ceremonial badge of honor, which I forgot to say here. But yes, the mathematician is like that for the theoretical class, because only through mathematics, only through geometry are we able to distinguish theoretical as different from these things. And we're able to say that everybody who does not maintain that sort of syllogistic reason is not within theoretical, that is not theoretical science. That is why the mathematician is like the great king's royal cavalry, because the mathematician provides the example of what we can distinguish the sophist and the rhetorician and every kind of imposter by their standard of syllogistic demonstrations, their forms of demonstrations and proofs, that the mathematicians maintain that standard which we use to distinguish philosophy and dialectic from every other imposter of the sophist and rhetoricians and everything like that, who don't have the standard that mathematicians exemplify, that geometry exemplifies, of syllogistic reasoning, of demonstrations, demonstrating something from self-evident premises so that the conclusion has the same structural stability. That is his point. Then see if the mathematician didn't secure the head of the theoretical class through the same way a general obtains kingship through a victory over the threat to the whole state. And here, when I'm talking about something else, I should have said that the general is always the executive, that the best general is always the executive and not the best executive takes over the general. Because that's how things were for the Roman consuls. And that is really what was the case for George Washington's presidency, that they thought, yeah, the consul, I don't know what other standard they were looking to, what other executive that wasn't a monarchy they were looking to, that the Roman consul's first responsibility is defense of the state in terms of military defense. But I didn't say that here. And I mean here that the mathematician can claim the chief theoretical science over the philosopher because he can defend theoretical science when the philosopher can't, without looking to the mathematician, without looking to geometry, and without looking to those kinds of proofs. And see if the mathematician didn't secure the head of the theoretical class through the same way a general obtains kingship through a victory over a threat to the whole state. How do you mean? See also if you think the victory of saving the theoretical science from the practical and the poetical, rhetorical, and sophistical arts doesn't grant it a position that it rightly deserves. How again do you mean? Are there then theoretical sciences that fall outside the application of mathematics? Suppose a mathematician is pleading his own case for chief position of the theoretical sciences, and he is speaking to us after making the philosopher along with his own art to be separate from the sophistic, rhetorical, and statesman arts. And suppose he asks us whether all theoretical science falls under the application of number and shape, or if there can be theoretical science without applying one and same and different and two and equal and unequal, and such things that are characteristic of mathematics. How will we answer him? I can't see how we can find a science that doesn't use one, many, same, different, such terms at all. And imagine he doesn't force us to theorize without number directly, and only ask us if there is anything that doesn't either have interval, I mean space and dimension, or not have interval. How will we respond to him then? We will have to say that everything is either with or without interval, space, and dimension. Now, suppose he asks us if everything that is only divisible along one interval is a line, which we call a single dimension, and everything that is divisible along two intervals is a surface, which we call two-dimension, and everything divisible along three intervals is a body, which we call three-dimensional. Is that way of speaking about dimensions of magnitude familiar to you, Theaetetus? Yes, I would agree to that. Isn't that intuitive in considering the meaning of the word dimension? For the legislators must have looked to its parts dia, which means two, or else perhaps to a shortened form of dia, meaning across, and to the second part, mensuration or measurement, synthesizing out of those some meaning about measurement along lines. Yes, that is intuitive in the word. And aren't each of those dimensions the subject of mathematics or some other science to determine if the regular kinds of lines are straight and circular, and the irregular class mixed, and of regular and irregular figures according to the equality or inequality of their sides? No, that must fall within the mathematician's science. And don't mathematicians claim that same territory as the subject of their measurements with numbers along lines and their corresponding numerical evaluations of surfaces and bodies? Yes, that usually falls under their sciences. Then if we were to evaluate the position of mathematics, we must admit that nothing else can claim the domain of space, interval, and dimension, except the mathematician. If you don't admit the geometer that domain, then at least mechanics and everything that has to do with motion in space, both astronomy and physics, claim to be mathematical also. Yes, the mathematician has claim to the domain of interval and space, whether of lines, surfaces, bodies, or the motion of anything along any of those. And that much isn't even disputed. Then imagine if the mathematician asks us if everything that doesn't have dimension, space, or interval, whatever you wish to call it, whether that is not the mathematician's domain also. How would he put the question? He would say, do you call that which has no space or interval discrete? And do you mean by that the opposite of continuous, which can always be divided? I don't know how to respond. Between the units of a duad or those of a triad or tetrad or any other number, is there any space between them? I don't mean when points are made in the sand or some number of specific things are counted, but the 2 or 3 itself. Does it not have its multiple units unseparated by space, so that one part isn't over here and another over there and another somewhere else, but the triad and tetrad being discrete and not along a continuum, for example, have their units or parts together, not like the fingers of a hand counted in part in succession, and unlike points, which when placed one on the other, there is neither increase in magnitude nor in numerical quantity. And as such, numbers or numerals can't be divided by anything coming between them or cutting them at any point of any line, since there is no separation between them in space, since they are discrete and not parts of a continuum, and without magnitude. First, should we admit that about number and the class of discrete quantity? Or do you think you can divide numerals like the triad or tetrad by moving them apart in space and produce them by bringing their parts together in space? I follow the argument that 3 or 4, that is not 3 or 4 horses or donkeys or anything else except for 3 or 4 units, doesn't have a dimension of space or magnitude to be either pulled apart or brought together. So if the mathematician asks us if this domain of spaceless numerals isn't also his own, what will we say? We will have to either contend with arithmetic or concede to mathematics' chief position among theoretical science. And the other sciences that are without interval and space, like harmonics, could they conceivably function without using terms like both, 2, 1, half, equal, and the same? No, they must use or serve under arithmetic. Then let's continue with the mathematician and suppose the philosopher is with us. And we together with him, and we ask questions in turn to the mathematician, now that he has already made us agree about his position among the theoretical sciences, and helped rid the theoretical class of the rhetorician, the sophist, and the statesman. I'm going to stop there.